The Green Party had its AGM on the weekend and released its election manifesto, though that might not have been what you're thinking of.
Well, it didn't really seem to dominate the headlines, did it?
Not exactly, and I think that's partly because poor Greens, at the same time they were doing that, ACT was releasing a policy that stole the limelight, and that was its promise to put 17-year-olds through the adult justice system. That was a lot more prominent, and that proposal got top billing on the home pages of our major news sites. It shunted the Greens manifesto down the run sheet of News Hub at 6 on Sunday. And it didn't quite do the same on One News at 6. Instead, that show ran the two stories as a kind of political mashup. So here's how the intro to that story went.
ACT is selling itself as the party of law and order with a controversial policy to have 17-year-olds charged as adults. Meanwhile, the Green Party's released its full manifesto.
Now I don't have any inside information, but I think the ACT would probably be feeling pretty good about getting a single policy release, more coverage or ahead of the coverage of a party's full manifesto, as it was said there.
So do you think this was an intentional effort to knock the Greens off the front page on their big day?
I don't know. It would be pretty clever if that was the case, because I think it's a bit of an exploit of a media structural issue here. Whatever the intention, that's what it did pretty successfully. And don't get me wrong, this kind of stuff happens a lot. I don't think there's any conspiracy at play here. But I thought it was a pretty good case study in some of those structural biases that shape our media coverage. Because if you're deciding just from a bird's eye view, what is the most important story? What's the most important story for the country? The Greens releasing their full election manifesto probably is going to eclipse ACT releasing a single controversial justice policy. That's not to say that ACT's policy isn't worth covering, of course. But in the Greens, you have a party that's in government, and some of this suite of policies could be adopted by the next government, depending on the election results. So, obviously, that's not the calculus of our news editors. That's not what they're using when they're deciding what to cover and to what extent. And maybe Green supporters will say those news judgments reflect an editorial bias to the right or towards ACT in general. But I think the actual bias at play is more fundamental to the industry than any political bias from editors or journalists.
No, what works is clicks, isn't it, really? What will rate is going to factor in that editorial decision-making rather than just, what's important.
Yeah, exactly. What's exciting, and this is a more exciting story, a more debatable story. And, these are commercial media companies, and their viability, their ability to survive rests on their commercial performance. Though, some are pursuing these premium strategies which augment their priorities a bit, but in most cases, their economic incentives are still heavily weighted towards growing that audience, engaging their audience over necessarily producing what is the most, quote marks, worthy content. And so you can sell engagement, audience numbers to advertisers, they look good on your annual report, and in that environment, a large, very important manifesto of policies is likely to not be as enticing for editors as a simple policy that gets people on both sides of the political aisle riled up. And that was, I think, evident in how the story was treated on News Talk ZB. There's too many newses in front of our news organisation names. This is how the station's Sunday host, Raman Travers, gave David Seymour a send-off after their 17-minute interview.
I've been waiting for this for a few months, David, and I'm very pleased that somebody's taking it seriously and putting stuff on paper with a pen. So David Seymour, ACT Party leader, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, Roman. Thanks, everyone listening.
Yeah, good on you. Thank you. Out there in the wind. How many politicians are out there on a day like today actually being politicians? They're probably sitting at home with a Sauvignon cardboard, enjoying reruns of the rugby. Good old David Seymour there.
Yeah, that's Raman Travers sending off David Seymour after their interview about sending teenagers through the adult justice system, and that contrasted pretty starkly with his first question to Green co-leader Marama Davidson.
So, you've released your 2023 election manifesto. Quite simply, is it simply easy to make it simple? What's the point in releasing a huge manifesto?
Little bit of word salad there. Look, I don't want to put my own phrasing up for too much of a close analysis, but it wasn't the best phrased question ever. But I thought that question was pretty instructive. Why didn't you make it simple?
So, in short, why didn't you put out something?
Yeah, that's something a little
simple,
bit that we can just digest. And I mean, right, this is News Talk. There might possibly be a little bit of political favoritism at play in that interview with good old David Seymour. But and you can see that, I think, the next day. Case in point, this is David Seymour talking to Jamie Mackay on the same station on The Country.
You're going to lock up 17-year-olds. Is this a universal lock-up for all 17-year-olds? Because they can be rather pesky adolescents at that age. Do we lock them all up for a year, then let them out when they're 18?
Well, I was at boarding school when I was 17, so pretty much was locked up until further notice. But no, I don't think we should lock up all 17-year-olds and then release them if they're good.
Ha ha. Ha ha ha. But yucking it up a little bit. But having said that, it's not all just sympathy or with that side of the political spectrum. I mean, talk radio hosts, they're attuned to what their audience wants, and a single, clear, provocative point is usually going to be easier to digest and probably prompt a few more calls than a technical set of policies, even if they're more substantive.
And there's also the fact that newsrooms are stretched. Some stories are just easier to cover than others.
Yeah, and this is the other fundamental thing with the media. It's a bias of sorts, but it's not a bias in their views. I mean, covering something like the Green Manifesto is a more time-intensive task than repurposing a press release from ACT, possibly with a little bit of additional comment from David Seymour. And credit to organisations like the Herald and stuff. They did do that work. I mean, Glenn McConnell and stuff, Michael Nielsen of the Herald, they put together some pretty comprehensive coverage. McConnell even found a clickable way to frame things. His story was headlined, 5 policies you might not have expected from the Greens Manifesto, and it was popular on Stuff on Monday. But that sort of stuff takes resources. I mean, you're sending people along to the venue, you're digesting a whole bunch of information, and as a result, those stories are up later in the day. They took a bit more work. Mm-hmm. And there's just the reality of staffing in newsrooms as well. On weekends, particularly in digital teams, staffing is pretty threadbare. Sometimes you just got to chuck up what you can chuck up. And as RNZ found out recently with its Russiagate saga, those staffing constraints can sometimes mean news that doesn't meet your usual standards can sneak through a bit easily. And sometimes tuning out a press release from a political party helps fill the space. And again, that resourcing often comes down to the fact these are commercial organisations. Their funding for staff only stretches as far as their profit margins allow, and those profit margins are pretty tight.
So I guess you're saying that there can be a conflict between news organisations' commercial imperatives and, I guess, their news values. Yeah,
I think that's the central issue here. I mean, and it's a long-standing one. We rightly hold up the media as a core part of our democracy. They're meant to hold the government to account, to dig deep into the policy issues of the day, to broaden our understanding of them, but sometimes fulfilling that function is just not going to be as popular with the audience or as engaging as putting up maybe a less enlightening but more exciting story. And in this case, I think the Greens were forced down the bulletins and the news list by some engagement-friendly content, and maybe they'll do it to another party the next time. And this isn't a new problem, and perhaps it's not even a dire one, because good journalism, I'm very keen to say, it still gets produced every day. But it's still a dilemma that a core part of our political system is essentially a loss leader for ad-driven media in a lot of cases. We're farming out some of our democratic functions to companies which are meant to complete that vital work as an act of, if not charity, then at least not according to the harshest commercial calculus.
But of course, public media is meant to be part of that answer as well, right?
Yeah, and that's why we had stuff like the much maligned public interest journalism fund. People said, oh, well, you're going to be beholden to the government. Actually, what it was doing was mainly filling those gaps in the commercial media where stuff that wasn't viable, according to that harsh commercial calculus, was being funded so that it would still take place, which is good for our democracy. I mean, it's why you have initiatives like Open Justice, where you send people to courts and fielding or something which might not get covered, or the Local Democracy Reporting Scheme, where you send people to councils that obviously don't necessarily, that kind of role is not really that viable for a news organisation. And RNZ, we're meant to be another media outlet that can cover what we want without adhering to commercial imperatives. And to a certain extent, that's true. You see it in RNZ's arts coverage. For instance, it produces a breadth and a depth of arts coverage that has kind of dropped out of commercial media because of funding constraints. But even RNZ, it still has its visitor targets, its website click targets, that kind of stuff. Even its editorial decisions, even just its competitiveness, they're still made according to the same calculus in some ways as commercial media. And the company's argument for that is that, well, we need to give the government bang for its buck. If it's spending this much money, we want to reach as big an audience as possible. But it does have to balance that with another task, and that is filling those gaps and really catering to audiences that may not adequately be served by commercial media alone.
There's another notable thing about that particular Sunday, the bloody Sunday.
Yeah.
It's another set of policies announced on a Sunday. This seems to be the day. It's become a bit of a trend in this election, right?
Yeah.
Sunday's the day to get it out there.
It's a craze. It's an election craze. We're totally just launching all our policies on Sunday. It's become a popular day for doing it, and TVNZ's Q&A in particular has become a bit of a launching pad for political parties, particularly national. Now, Q&A had a couple of pages of the Green Manifesto last weekend. National has used it more frequently. It's launched a bunch of policies on the show, including its full suite of housing policies, including its back down from the Medium Density Housing Accord, its proposal to overturn a ban on genetic engineering, its proposal to fast-track consenting on renewable energy, its Three Waters alternative. So these are these kind of things it's doing.
Is it the likes of Q&A that are driving that, the longer form?
Yeah,
interview?
I don't know whether this is a particular strategy from Q&A. I think there's definitely a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours element to this, because the political parties can go on this show and speak to what's really a niche but highly obsessed political audience where they're going to comment about it incessantly. The politicians are going to get a bunch of time to really explain their policy in a way that they might not have done in any other situation. And it's such a niche audience that there's not other news organisations aren't going, oh no, it's been on Q&A, we can't cover it now. And Sunday's such a light day when it comes to news. It's often a dearth of news that you'll find that a policy will launch on Q&A in the morning and it'll still lead the 6 p.m. bulletins later that night. So there's not really a lot of downsides. It's quite a good strategic move, I think, and one I think we'll see other parties employ as October 14 gets closer.
Now, we just talked about stories that only contain a single point of view in politics. You also saw a transport story that had the same issue this week.
That's right. So Stuff printed a story cleverly headlined "The Not Fast and the Very Furious 30 km per hour limit plans for NZ towns" on Monday. Now, its first sentence is, quote, "Plans to reduce speed limits to 30 km per hour in suburban streets are absolute insanity," critics say. And generally in that kind of story with that kind of lead, you might hear what the non-critics say as well, but that wasn't really the case in this one.
Why? Was there no room?
There was definitely room. It's the internet. There's a lot of pixels on there, I understand it. It was really a single perspective story, and these single perspective stories are usually just write-offs from press releases. You see it a bit maybe from political parties or campaigners or lobby groups, and they're put up to fill a news hole or to move a story along that's been printed earlier in the day. Again, actors, are pretty good at taking advantage of that and getting out quick fire releases on issues of the day and just getting up a story that might be just from their perspective. And I'll note the Media Council has said that that kind of coverage isn't necessarily a deal breaker, that you don't have to include every perspective in every story, and that you can create balance across the broad breadth of your coverage. But this story about pedestrian, well, not about speed limits, sorry, it went to the trouble of quoting multiple people. There's Tauranga's local MP Sam Uffindell, a car reviewer, a furious mayor, a bike shop owner who wants cars to keep going the same speed, and a local business person who was the most confusing, who said that Tauranga's drivers are the worst in the country and should be allowed to go faster for some reason. I didn't. Those 2 points didn't quite marry up. They're awful. They don't indicate. They swerve all over the road, and I want them to be able to go as fast as they're going now.
Get out of there.
I thought this is a good argument for slowing these guys down. They sound horrible. Anyway, the only lines actually explaining the rationale for lowering speed limits are the last two of the story, where Transport Minister David Parker is quoted as saying Waka Kotahi's Road to Zero strategy is now projected to lead to a 30 to 35% reduction in road deaths and serious injuries by 2030. And I found this a little bit frustrating as someone who pays a bit of attention to transport issues.
What would you have liked?
Well, this is such an interesting topic because there's a heap of research on the impact of lower speed limits, and some of it's counterintuitive. I mean, the main finding is that a collision between a car and a pedestrian at 50 kilometres per hour is fatal in 80% of cases. Now, that drops to 10% at 30 kilometres per hour, so it's almost exponential. Meanwhile, we've done studies tracking journey times at different speeds. So Waka Kotahi's done one on a 4-kilometre journey on local roads, and at a speed limit of 50 kilometres an hour, there was about an 11 to 42 second difference from the same journey at a speed limit of 40 kilometres per hour. So it's not as major as you'd think. And if you think about it for a bit, that's because, well, a lot of the time on local roads, you're just going to the next traffic light anyway. You're just getting there faster. And basically, this is just one of those counterintuitive policy areas where often the evidence doesn't jibe with what people's default assumptions are going to be. So, for instance, widening a road, you might think that'll ease traffic. It actually doesn't. In fact, it induces demand for more driving and it fails as a solution to congestion. Conversely, you'd think that reducing road space is always going to increase congestion. It's not the case again. There's this phenomenon called traffic evaporation. This is all kind of counterintuitive but interesting stuff, and I'd love it to be included. I mean, or even just the rationale for lowering speed limits to be included in a story like this, because, I mean, if you want to cover this topic, you're wanting to leave your audience better informed than when they started reading, and instead of that we got a lot of heat, or in the headlines words, fury, but not so much light.
Now, before we move on, you had some harsh words for another piece of media coverage, this time from, wait for it, RNZ's Mediawatch.
Indeed. This is tough stuff to admit, but this is a mea culpa by Mediawatch, and on Sunday's show you might have heard this intro from Colin Peacock.
The New Zealand Listener magazine is, by any measure, a stayer.
Now that was an introduction to an interview I did with Sideswipe author Anna Samways. A pretty good interview, you can seek it out if you want, but was that intro good enough to play twice in a row? Apparently, Mediawatch thought so, because that's what it did on Sunday morning.
The New Zealand Listener magazine is, by any measure, a stayer.
Was that? We did it again! What's happening?
Was this really an editorial decision? Or was it a technical hitch?
Oh, you wouldn't believe this, mate, but I
must have been a good interview, Hayden. You were there. I mean,
I guess that Colin must have loved it. I mean, I do have some inside information on this story. I interviewed the person who edited the Mediawatch show. That was Colin Peacock. He sent a statement to me. I can read it. It reports that this was a digital anomaly or even a deliberate move to check if listeners were paying attention or that the intro was so good people should hear it twice. They're all incorrect. It was a case of human error, one human in particular, himself. That's Colin writing in third person there. In spite of checking the recording, he didn't spot the duplication, which was fixed before the replay of the show at 10 p.m. He apologises and says it won't happen again. And if it does, he hopes it's someone else's fault. I guess that would be me.
Yes.
I've got information on Colin. He's now reportedly at home with the windows closed, the curtains drawn. He plans to re-emerge carrying a duffel bag full of bricks with the word shame stenciled on them in Dayglow letters in time to make a repetition-free episode this Sunday.
The news crews and the lights from the television outside broadcast units outside his home.
I understand that it's pretty stressful in there at the moment. There's quite a lot of condemnation from the media, a lot of pressure going on.
Gosh almighty, we had the pro-Russia edits scandal on RNZ and now this.
Yeah, it's been a dreadful few months for RNZ, but we're apologising to our listeners. We're turning a page. We're hoping it won't happen again.
Now, one of the big news stories of the weekend, sports stories, was nothing to do with the results, even though they were pretty darn good, but the response to All Blacks captain Sam Cane when he foot-tripped or kicked a pitch invader on the weekend in Argentina.
Yeah, now you'd think, what did you think of the...
Well, I thought it was a reflex action. I think I saw him turn around and he just stuck his foot out. He saw this thing running.
That was a kick. Yeah, you thought that was a reflex?
Well, I mean, he saw something, put your foot out,
Sometimes.
That's what foot trips are like, aren't they? They kind of...
I think that he lined this one up. I mean, I've done an instinctive foot trip before. I don't know. It was the kind of thing you thought.
But he was
first.
standing in the huddle, and this guy came round the back of the huddle somewhat, and you think he turned around, saw him, and then I'm gonna trip him up.
Yeah, I think so, because it was a full kick.
Was it a kick or a trip?
We're
going to start another one.
Yeah, I don't know. We go.
All right.
I think he lined him up. Sometimes you just feel like it, You're just like, oh, come on.
Well, I've heard players afterwards talking about the frustration of that. With it's all very well for the spectators to get a bit. I think most spectators actually get bloody annoyed with it as well. But some think, it's a bit of fun. It'll be interesting to see how good the security guards are at tackling. I mean, that's what you're thinking about. But you can imagine frustration.
Have you ever been a pitch invader yourself,
No,
Mark?
not my style at all.
No, I can't do it myself, but not because I'm particularly ideologically averse to it, but because I don't like the attention.
Yeah, I can't.
You wouldn't believe that, but it's true.
Well, you'd think someone like me wouldn't mind the attention, but that's far from the truth. But no, it just doesn't. I don't know. It just seems patently stupid. Really, I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be good viral advertising for you, though, if you're gone on the pitch with sort of Tux Wonder Dogs tattooed on your back.
Did you know about that tattoo, did you?
Yeah, I did. I understand that the full crew got that. Anyway, this was we've gone off topic.
We have somewhat.
But it's the kind of thing that we thought would be widely condemned by the sports media. And it did appear to be being condemned at first. Andrew Gordy said it wasn't a good look. He's a One News sports presenter. The RNZ reporter Ben Strang called it a genuinely thuggish act. But as it turns out, many sports reporters didn't agree with that assessment, and actually a surprising unanimity emerged around what was seen as Kane's righteous cause here. So sports commentator Jason Pine said on Twitter, "If you don't run on the field, everything is fine. Utter entitlement to think it's okay. Sam Cane has nothing to apologise for me." And Scotty Stevenson, he took things, usually a liberal member of the sports establishment, but he was not happy with this. He took things even further, saying that Cane didn't go far enough.
I reckon he should have kicked him harder. Get off the field. Pitch invaders are a massive problem in sport at the moment, and these guys are in a foreign country. They've never played on this field before. And, the kid got what he deserved. Stop running on the field. Stop running on the field.
Agreed.
Sam Cane says he's
And also, look at the way he bounced back up. Kids are like rubber. They take a lot of punishment.
Yeah, well, he did bounce up pretty quickly and take off, didn't he? Yeah.
Well, I mean, sure.
Adrenaline, of course.
I mean, kids are like rubber, but I mean, still, from what I understand anyway, kicking them is still frowned upon. I mean, having said that, he's absolutely right. Pitch invaders are a real problem in sports lately, so hopefully this will deter further incidents. Another prominent sports commentator adopting that view and siding with the kicker, not the kicked, that was Murray Deaker. Name you.
Murray Deaker.
Here he is, speaking to News Talk ZB's Jamie Mackay again on the country.
So if you run onto the paddock, you deserve everything you get.
I'm with Scotty Stevenson from TVNZ. He's doing a piece tonight on that, and we were just discussing it. And he said, what's the guy meant to do? He's the captain of the All Blacks. There's a bloke hovering around, running towards his team, and he stuck his foot out, and he's getting crucified for doing it. Well, I wouldn't crucify him for doing that. He should have stuck both feet out, and when he'd uplifted him, given him a kick in the backside and got him off the ground.
Another further kicking ordered there, and Deaker went on to criticise the media for taking aim at Cane over the incident. Now, I don't think he should have worried so much. I mean, despite some early words of condemnation, in the end, I think violence really won the day here. The calls for further kickings were louder than the calls for fewer kickings. Did you think that the kicking was justified, Mark?
Well, as I say, it was a reflex action.
I
It was
don't.
something
I,
that, you know,
I'm
not going
if
kicking.
it wasn't a reflex, would you back it?
Well, I don't condone kicking of anybody. I mean, I
Well,
just don't
of course not.
agree with it.
Of course
But,
not. You're
it's shocking.
I have two wolves inside me on this one.
Yeah.
Like I can definitely understand the desire to kick.
Yeah. But I do find that frustrating.
It's frustrating.
Yeah,
But at the
And,
same
you know,
time,
you
I
could
think
say-
probably it's best not to kick children.
Yes, okay, yes, given. But, you know, he could have been carrying something dangerous.
This is,
I mean, who knows?
I
We
think
could
you're
take it
getting
another
into a
level.
dangerous area here because this is a call for like preemptive action.
Security guards
where
around
you
the
have to
team.
kick everyone in case they're carrying something dangerous.
Well, I remember a few years ago, it was Richie McCaw, and I think it was a guy called AJ Venter of the Springboks. They took out a guy who ran onto the field. They tackled him. I think he'd tried to attack the referee, so there was a good cause
Yeah,
for
Richie
that,
McCaw got him. Andrew Simons from the Australian cricket team did another one.
Did one of
shoulder.
those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway.
we'll move on.
So, I haven't had Murray Deaker's voice for a while. That's interesting. He's back, is he?
Yeah, but you're going to be hearing a bit more of it, provided you listen to his podcast, which is being produced by NZME. And he was speaking to Jamie Mackay there, of course, where he confirmed he'd got on board with the golf and the leisurely lifestyle of retirement will be making a comeback.
So what can we expect? Is he back on the air, or what's going to be happening? It's a podcast.
Yeah, podcast. And there haven't been too many details yet, except for it's happening in August. But we know one thing we won't be hearing on Murray Deaker's podcast, and that's any of that woke stuff. So this is what Deaker said to Mackay.
Now, the good thing about you making a comeback, Murray, all joking aside, is that I think you'll give the wokesters a bit of a shake-up. You haven't got a PC bone in your body.
No, and I'm not going to put up with any of that rubbish either, because it is rubbish.
Wokesters, look out, Murray Deaker's coming for you on the podcast's audio waves. It's unclear what Deaker does consider woke, but he was once embroiled in a scandal after saying the N-word on air, so hopefully he's not planning to bring that one back. I mean, presumably not kicking pitch invaders is also on the woke spectrum. So that we'll definitely be having some pro-kicking content in there. I mean, perhaps after we've kicked them, we can lock them away with the 17-year-olds, following a fair trial, in an adult court, of course.
So the podcast in August with Murray Deaker. Now over to some international news media.
Yeah, before we go, there's a bit of a scandal brewing at the BBC. And that's because News Corp's tabloid newspaper The Sun broke a story over the weekend about a well-known BBC presenter allegedly paying an underage teenager £35,000 for sexually explicit photos. And that story relied seemingly solely on an interview with the apparently teenager's parents. However, since the story broke, the person who reportedly provided those photos, who's now 20, has said through a lawyer that the Sun story is rubbish and that nothing untoward happened. And British police have also confirmed that they have not opened a criminal investigation.
So are you saying, or are they saying, that the original story looks now a bit shaky from the Sun?
That's what it looks like. The Guardian published a story from its media editor Jim Waterson today, which said sources at the Sun are now trying to distance the paper from its original and most explosive allegation, and that's that the person the presenter paid for explicit images was under 18 years old. That's a crime in Britain. The age of consent is 16, but you can't have photos of someone under the age of 18, explicit photos. Waterson has also written a story for the paper's website with 5 key questions for The Sun, including whether it tried to contact the young person at the centre of its story before going to print. It seems like maybe it didn't. He also wants to know whether it has any hard evidence that the presenter broke the law. So those are all good questions to ask. They haven't been answered yet, though.
Well, following on from the Philip Schofield drama, it's interesting, isn't it? How is the BBC responding?
Yeah, it was criticised by The Sun for not taking action when apparently this young person's parents complained to it 7 or so weeks ago. It has now it's suspended the presenter in question, and it's added its own reporting to the scandal. It interviewed another man, a 23-year-old man, who was also contacted by this presenter on a dating app, and according to its report, the 23-year-old received a series of what he said were abusive and threatening messages after hinting that he might name the presenter. Now, the BBC's report says it has seen those messages, but it hasn't detailed their content, and that didn't impress the former Guardian editor Alan Rusbridger, who described the situation like this. Famous person uses dating app, links up with an adult, nothing comes of it, they never meet, the adult threatens to write about it online, famous person is very angry, lead item on BBC News. And he went on to say that he agreed with the person who said the BBC often overcompensates against allegations of bias by going harder on its own people in an attempt to be seen as impartial.
So what you'd describe as an extremely messy situation for them.
Yeah, and one presumably with a bit more reporting to come. Who knows what the Sun has up its sleeve? Maybe we should watch this space. Either way, it's a relatively high stakes situation for two large media organisations in the UK. In the case of the Sun, it risks a defamation lawsuit if it's accused someone of a criminal act without any actual evidence for that, and it's actually untrue. The BBC also has obviously a lot of reputational damage at stake here. The presenter is named, and its response to the allegations is not found to have been up to scratch.
Well, we wait with a great deal of interest on that one. What a year it's been in the UK for television presenters. I've got to say, very sad news, the death of Steve Orsbourn, a widely respected and very well-liked, much-loved video journalist.
Yeah, really sad news. I worked with Steve at the Herald about 10, 12 years ago. He's a really lovely guy, really well-liked in the industry, just had a lot of time for people, a really unique personality as well. Did you work with him?
I've worked with him over the years, a number of times actually. The Young Farmer Contest, we used to do that for about 16 years, and he was regular on that, doing various reports. So, yeah, lovely guy, and very easy to work with, and such a stellar operator.
He's worked
to create
just
wonderful
about
shots.
everyone, eh?
He has.
Yeah, and he had a beautiful portfolio. We're looking at it today.
Fantastic. It's very sad indeed. So thoughts and best wishes go to Steve's family on his death. Thanks, Hayden. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And Media Watch, of course, returns on Sunday. Colin at the helm.
Yes, Colin at the helm this time round.
But you'll only get one version of it. He's not going to play it through twice.
He's going to be very meticulous about checking that.
Good on you, man.